All right, so we're going to talk about Chapter 27. And Chapter 27 is an overview of fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and acid-base balance. So we're looking at balance this chapter. So fluid is important because water is 99% of the volume outside of cells. So outside the cells, meaning in the extracellular fluid. And if that's really low, then enzymes stop working inside the cell, the proteins denature, and the cells die if it becomes too low. Electrolyte imbalance is very important too. There's some very important electrolytes we're going to look at, like sodium and calcium and potassium. And for instance, calcium and potassium, if they're too high in the extracellular fluid, then cardiac arrhythmias can occur. And then we're going to look at acid-base, which is basically the pH of your body and your tissues in your blood. And if the pH is outside of normal, then the cells become impaired. So in order to understand all of these imbalances, like the cells dying, like calcium and potassium causing arrhythmias, or pH causing cells to become impaired, those are all imbalances. We first have to look at the balance of each of these things to understand imbalances. These three processes of fluid balance and electrolyte imbalance and acid-base balance, they stabilize the volumes of your body fluids, they stabilize the solute concentrations in your body fluids, and they stabilize the pH of both the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. So if we look at these three processes individually, the fluid that you take in the gain of the fluid that you take in comes in through the digestive system or the GI tract. So it's what you eat and drink. And the loss of this fluid is through the urinary system. Fluid balance then occurs when the gains equal the losses. With electrolytes, the gain is through the digestive system. So what you're eating and drinking that contains those electrolytes. And the loss is through the urine, sweat, and feces. Here again, the balance occurs when the gains equal the losses. That means that, how much you're taking in through what you're eating and drinking is being lost through what you urinate, sweat, and what's found in your feces. Then we look at acid-base balance, and the acids and bases are gained through metabolism. So acids are generated, and when acids are generated, that decreases your pH. The loss of acids is through the kidneys. Kidneys can secrete hydrogen ions, which we saw in exchange for sodium. And they can also generate buffers. We saw how they can make bicarbonate, which is a buffer, and then that bicarbonate enters into the bloodstream to raise the pH. And then the loss is also through the lungs. And in the lungs, they eliminate carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, we're going to see the equation in which carbon dioxide acts like an acid in the body. In this video, we're going to look at fluid balance. And so to get started, we need to look at where all the fluids are in your body. So let's first look at how much water is in your total body weight. So of your total body weight, for the male, we'll start with the male, 60% of their total body weight is water. In the female, 50% of her total body weight is water. Adipose contains 10% of the body fluids. And skeletal muscle contains 75%. Your body fluid can be divided into the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. So let's first take a look at the intracellular and extracellular fluid. So first of all, the extracellular fluid it makes up 1/3 of all the fluid, 1/3, whereas the intracellular fluid makes up 2/3 of all of the fluid in your body. So looking at your intracellular fluid, this is the fluid in all the cells of your body. So cells are very, very small, but you also have billions of cells in your body. And that's why the extracellular fluid makes up 2/3 of all the fluid in your body. The extracellular fluid then makes up 1/3 of all the fluid in your body. There are different compartments of the extracellular fluid. The two major compartments where your extracellular fluid is found is in the interstitial fluid and in your plasma. So right here you can see this is a picture of a blood vessel here. So there's a drawing of a blood vessel. And inside the blood vessel you have the plasma, and then of course you would have those formed elements, which are like your red blood cells and white blood cells. So the plasma is an extracellular fluid. And then right outside of the blood vessel, and it's between the blood vessel and the tissues, or even in between the cells of the tissue, you have interstitial fluid. So interstitial fluid is also a major extracellular fluid. Then there are some minor fluids in your body. So think about all the other places that you have fluid in your body. You have fluid, serous fluid. Serous fluid is the fluid found between the visceral and the parietal layers of your serous membranes, like your pleura and your pericardium and your peritoneum. You also have fluid that is your cerebral spinal fluid. Lymph is also a minor extracellular fluid. The aqueous humor that's found in your anterior cavity of your eye is an extracellular fluid. And the endolymph and the perilymph, which are fluids found in your bony labyrinth in your ear, those are also minor extracellular fluids. So when we're looking at this balance of body fluids, there are 4 basic concepts that you need to keep in mind. First of all, the homeostatic mechanisms respond to the extracellular fluid, not to the intracellular fluid. Meaning your body's going to respond if the fluid in your extracellular fluid goes up or down, or if the electrolyte balances in your extracellular fluid are off, or if the pH is off in your extracellular fluid. It's not responding to what's going on inside your cells. The second basic concept is that no receptors directly monitor fluid levels or electrolyte concentrations of specific electrolytes. So in other words, these receptors that you have in your body, they can't tell you how many fluid ounces of fluid you have, or what the exact electrolyte concentration is of sodium. Instead, the receptors monitor the plasma volume and the osmotic concentration. So it's just looking to see, has the volume gone up or down from where it is normally? And has the osmotic concentration increased or decreased from where it is normally? The next basic concept is that cells can't actively transport water. So we can manipulate the solute concentrations in the extracellular fluid, and that will draw water towards the solutes, but we can't actively transport water. The conditions will dictate which way water moves. We know that water moves towards the solute. So in order to move water, you would have to move solutes towards where you want the water to move. The fourth basic concept is that if the gain of fluid or of the electrolytes exceed the losses, then water and electrolyte levels go up. But if the losses exceed the gains, then the water and electrolyte levels fall. That just makes sense. So if you're drinking and eating a lot of water and electrolytes, then the water and the electrolyte levels are going to go up. But if you're losing a lot of water and electrolytes through like sweating, then the water and electrolytes in your extracellular fluid is going to go down. It's going to fall. So those are the basic concepts. Now there's some hormones that I just want to go back and kind of review. ADH is a hormone that is secreted from the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and when it's released, it will stimulate water retention or reabsorption. So it causes you to retain water, and when you retain water, of course, then your extracellular fluid will increase. Then we have aldosterone. Aldosterone is secreted from the adrenal cortex, and this hormone stimulates sodium and water reabsorption at the kidney. So it will cause an increase of both sodium and water in the extracellular fluid. Then we have natriuretic peptide, and that actually opposes ADH. So it will stimulate fluid loss at the kidney. It will cause the kidney to excrete and urinate out more fluids. The natriuretic peptide is produced by the cardiac muscle cells. When the muscle feels like you need to lower your blood volume because there's too much pressure against the walls of the atria and the ventricles, then these natriuretic peptides will be released so that your kidney will excrete more water. So fluid balance and electrolyte balance are related. So we're going to go over a couple of scenarios here. So here we have, in the first scenario, we have a balanced fluid and electrolyte level. So both the fluid and the electrolytes are balanced. So we can see here that we have the plasma level. That's what I drew with these lines. It's supposed to look like a little bit of water. So that's how much water is in the blood vessel. And then we have these electrolytes in there and floating around inside the plasma. And so I'm just saying sodium. Sodium is actually the most common electrolyte in the extracellular fluid, so I'm just kind of using sodium. So when we have fluid balance and electrolyte balance, you would have normal plasma volume and you would have normal electrolyte balance. So, or in other words, you'd have a normal osmotic concentration. So that's what I'm trying to show you in this picture here. We have a certain amount of fluid in there. So this is all the fluid, the water. And then we have a certain amount of electrolytes, and so sodium, and we have other electrolytes in there as well, but I'm just drawing in. This is just the normal concentration of sodium, and we have the normal fluid level. Now, when you lose water, so here I went from, the first picture where we saw the fluid level, at a certain level. And now in the second picture, I'm showing that the fluid level has gone down. So when you lose water, then your plasma volume decreases, right? So you don't have as much plasma in there, so your plasma volume decreases. But at the same time, if you haven't lost any of the electrolytes, then the electrolyte concentration actually goes up. So you can see you have the same amount of electrolytes, but now you have less fluid for those electrolytes to be floating in. So you have the electrolyte concentration will increase while the plasma volume decreases. So this is just showing that when you lose water, if you're losing water and not electrolytes, your plasma volume decreases and your electrolyte concentration increases. In the next picture, we see when you gain water, but you don't gain electrolytes. So here you can see the water volume now in your plasma has increased, right? So we have more water, but we have the exact same number of electrolytes. So the electrolytes have not increased, only the water has increased. So then what happens to the volume of the plasma? Well, the plasma volume increases. So plasma volume increases. And at the same time, then when we look at the sodium or the electrolyte concentration, the electrolyte concentration decreases. So that's what's going to happen when you gain water, when you're gaining water, but you're not gaining electrolytes. Okay, so let's keep going on. Now, what if you gain electrolytes without gaining water? So here we have a picture of, there's our normal water level, right? So normal water level, and now we've gained electrolytes. So we've had electrolytes, so maybe eating salty chips without actually taking in any extra fluid. So you're eating all this salt, so we got sodium chloride in here creating a lot of more electrolytes. So we gained electrolytes. Well, what happens? The electrolyte concentration goes up, right? Of course, because you gained electrolytes. But when that happens, then you're going to have an osmotic pressure increase. So all of these electrolytes, they are increasing the osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure is the draw of water towards those electrolytes. So what happens then is that water in the interstitial fluid, which is outside of the blood vessel here, water will move in towards those electrolytes. It follows the electrolytes. When that happens, then our water level in our plasma, or the fluid level in the plasma, increases. And it'll continue doing that until the concentration is balanced between the plasma and the interstitial fluid. Then we have the situation when you lose electrolytes, but you're not losing water at the same time. Let's see what happens then. So here we have our normal level of fluid in the blood vessel, and we've lost electrolytes, but not water. So here we see that our electrolytes have decreased. We don't have as many electrolytes, so the concentration of the total electrolytes have decreased. So now water is going to be lost due to osmotic pressure. Water leaves the blood vessel, and then the water level inside the blood vessel goes down. And it will just continue to do this until the equilibrium has been reached and the plasma concentration is the same as the interstitial fluid. So every day you have daily losses and gains. As far as fluid goes, the water that you gain is around 2,500 milliliters per day. That's how much water you're gaining. And you're getting that water from food, drink, and then metabolism of your cells. We know that during oxidative phosphorylation, water is produced in the electron transport system. Then we also have water lost every day. So water, the same amount of water that was gained, 2,500 milliliters, will also be lost, 2,500 milliliters per day. And we lose that water through processes in the urinary system, so through urine, through feces in the digestive system, and then through insensible perspiration. Insensible perspiration refers to the perspiration that happens before it's even perceived or sensed. Insensible perspiration occurs from both the skin and the respiratory tract. Insensible perspiration is not from glands. Instead, it is just a water loss from the interstitial fluids that evaporate from the skin or from water evaporation from the lungs. The water losses have some variables. For example, sensible perspiration, which comes from glands, and mostly what we're talking about are sweat glands here, but it can also be from sebaceous glands. Sensible perspiration it's going to vary with activity level, but it will increase water loss. So the more you sweat, the more water you're losing. Then we also have fever. So fever will also cause an increase in water loss. And it can increase it by 200 mils. Water moves very easily between the extracellular fluid compartments. So if you remember, I said that we have the interstitial fluid, so that's outside of the blood vessels, and then we have the plasma, which is inside the blood vessel, right? So those are two extracellular fluids, interstitial fluid and plasma. The plasma contains about 20% of the extracellular fluid, whereas the interstitial fluid contains 80% of the extracellular fluid if you also include the minor compartments, all of those other smaller minor compartments that we talked about. So 80% for the interstitial fluid and minor compartments, and 20% of the fluid is found in the plasma. So water's going to move pretty freely between these compartments. We've seen before that as the hydrostatic pressure from the heartbeat pushes blood through the capillaries, the fluid hits the sides of the capillary walls and water will be forced out. That's called filtration. So the hydrostatic pressure from your blood pressure is forcing fluids out of the blood vessels. So there's a lot of exchange between the plasma and the interstitial fluid. It's very natural and very fast. And 85% of the water then will be recaptured and will go back into the blood vessel like we've talked about in the past. And 15% of that will go into the lymphatic capillary and become lymph. And then eventually the lymphatic capillary will go to the subclavian veins, and that fluid will be dumped back into the blood vessels then. I want to talk about edema here. So when you have an increased or an abnormal amount of fluid in the interstitial fluid, so you have excess water out in the interstitial fluid, that's called edema. If you had increased fluid in the plasma, that would contribute to high blood pressure. But when you have excess water out in the interstitial fluid, which is out here outside of the blood vessel, then we call that edema, right? So edema, we have a couple of different types of edema. There's pulmonary edema and there's generalized edema. Both of them can be caused from increased pressure in the systemic capillaries. So what that means is if you have like a high blood pressure or you have something else that is increasing the pressure inside the capillary, you have too much pressure, that means water will be forced out faster than it should be or in greater quantities than it should be, and then you end up with this excess water and edema. So if it happens in the lungs, we call that pulmonary edema, where the fluid's being pushed out of the pulmonary capillaries. But if you have it in the rest of the systemic capillaries, then we call it generalized edema. So you either have pulmonary edema or generalized edema. Another cause of generalized edema, though, is if you have a decrease in the colloid osmotic pressure. So that blood colloid osmotic pressure is from these plasma proteins. So if you have less of those proteins, if those proteins are gone, and we no longer have those, or we don't have as many as we do normally, then there's not going to be as much of a pull to bring that 85% back into the blood vessel. So where does the water sit? It's going to sit out in the interstitial fluid. So if you have a decrease in colloid osmotic pressure, not as many plasma proteins, then water is not going to be reabsorbed as likely. So when would that happen? When would we have decreased plasma proteins? Well, if a person is starving themselves, right? So in starvation, a person would have decreased plasma proteins. And so if you don't have as many of these plasma proteins, if they're just not there, then there's nothing to pull that water back in, and then water is going to sit out in the interstitial fluid, and you're going to end up with generalized edema. When else would we have decreased plasma proteins? Well, where are plasma proteins produced? They're produced in the liver. So if we have liver disease and there's not as many plasma proteins being produced, we're going to see the same results. We don't have the plasma proteins, so water's not going to be drawn back into the blood vessel. Instead, water's going to sit out here in the interstitial fluid, and a person's going to end up with systemic edema. So this is just talking about how the fluids move between the compartments of the extracellular fluid. Now I want to talk to you about how the fluid moves between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. So water also moves between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. But this movement, we give it a name, it's called a fluid shift. And the water doesn't move as freely as it does across between the different compartments of the extracellular fluid. The fluid here between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid has to be drawn because of solutes. So water will move to create an equilibrium. It wants to create an equilibrium of solute concentration on both sides of the cell membrane. This is a rapid movement between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. It typically takes minutes to hours, which is really pretty rapid. The fluid shifts respond to changes in osmotic concentration of the extracellular fluid. So let's take a look at a couple of these drawings here. So here I've drawn the plasma, so we can see the plasma inside the blood vessel. And then I've drawn a space for the interstitial fluid. And then I've drawn some tissues here, and inside the cells of the tissue is the intracellular fluid. Now, I've also drawn solutes. So I tried to draw the solutes so it looked like the concentration inside the plasma was the same as the concentration inside the interstitial fluid, which is same as the concentration of solutes inside the cells or inside the intracellular fluid. And if you remember our ions, we know that sodium has a higher concentration outside the cells, so these all could be sodium molecules, and that potassium has a higher concentration inside the cells. It doesn't really matter what the solutes are, we're looking at the total solute concentration at this time. All right, so now that's equilibrium. There's the concentrations of the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid are the same. So now let's look at this situation. If the extracellular fluid concentration increases, then water moves out of the cells, or water shifts out of the cells, right? So let's take a look at the picture here. So in the plasma, I have increased the extracellular fluid concentration, and interstitial fluid is going to also increase. So whatever really happens in the plasma will also happen in the interstitial fluid, because remember, we have the pushing out of fluid and pushing out of ions, and then some of it's redrawn back in. So we have pretty much the same concentrations going on all the time between the plasma and the interstitial fluid. But now let's look at the cells. So inside the cells, we have the same solute concentration as we had above in the normal cells that were balanced. So now what do we know about water? Water wants to move from high water concentration to low water concentration. or what we can say is it moves from low solute to high solute. So here we see we have a lot of water inside the cells compared to the ions, and so water will move out. Water moves out of the cells and it moves into the interstitial fluid. Then what happens to the cells? The cells will shrink and the intracellular fluid, the volume, decreases. Right? So that's what's going to happen if these cells are put in a hypertonic solution. Now let's look at the opposite situation. What if the extracellular fluid concentration decreases? Well, in that case, water will move into the cell. So let's take a look. So here's the cells again, and we look at the solute concentration in the extracellular fluid. So whatever it is doing in the plasma, it's going to be doing in the interstitial fluid because they're both extracellular fluids. And the cells were sitting at the normal concentration that cells normally sit at, right? And so what happens in this case, these cells are really sitting in a hypotonic solution. And so the water from the hypotonic solution then will move into the cells. And so what will happen to the cells then? The cells are going to swell and the intracellular fluid is going to increase. Once we have an understanding of how fluid shifts between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid, we can then start talking about abnormal fluid balances. Or in other words, we can talk about fluid imbalances. And that's what we're going to do next. So first, let's talk about abnormal water losses, right? So we're losing an abnormal amount of water. So dehydration is one such type of abnormal water loss. This occurs when more water is lost than electrolytes. So you're losing more water than you are, say, sodium or chloride, right? So this can be caused by excessive sweating. When you're sweating, you're losing a lot more salt than you are fluid. Or it can be caused by decreased water consumption. If you're not drinking enough water, you're going to become dehydrated. It can also occur from vomiting and from diarrhea. You're going to be losing a lot more water than you are losing electrolytes. So in response to this, your water shifts out of the intracellular fluid until that equilibrium can be reached. So let's take a look at our picture here just to get an idea. So here we have our blood vessel, and this person is sweating or they're vomiting, they have diarrhea, and so their plasma volume goes down. Since their plasma volume goes down, their interstitial volume goes down, and then the cells are going to want to try to increase that extracellular fluid. Remember, we're always responding to what happens in the extracellular fluid. So in this case, the water from these cells is going to move through osmosis into the interstitial fluid, and then from there it can move into the plasma, right? So what happens then to the cells? The cells are going to shrink. So in dehydration, your cells shrink. And it'll continue doing that until they've reached equilibrium, until the concentration of the extracellular fluid equals the concentration of the intracellular fluid. That keeps happening until that balance, that equilibrium has been reached. But you still have lost fluid. So in the end, the extracellular fluid has less volume and is more concentrated, and now the intracellular fluid has less volume and is more concentrated. So dehydration then, by losing all this fluid, can cause a situation that we call hypernatremia. So hyper means too much, and Na means sodium, and emia means in the blood. So what we end up having is too much sodium in the blood, or too high of a concentration of sodium in the blood. Hypernatremia can be caused by either dehydration, or it can be caused by excessive salt intake without taking in fluid. So like eating a bag of salty chips without drinking any water along with it. So here we see what happens with hypernatremia. In the plasma, that's where hypernatremia is, because emia means in the blood. So you have too much, you have a high concentration or an increased concentration of sodium in the blood. Well, remember, whatever happens in the blood is going to happen in the interstitial fluid, so now we have increased sodium concentration in the interstitial fluid as well. So what will the response be? Well, water is going to leave the cells and will move into or shift into the extracellular fluid until equilibrium can be reached. It's going to do that to help to maintain plasma levels. Let's look at some responses that the body will have to dehydration and hypernatremia. Renin will be secreted, and what renin does is it causes increased thirst. So now you become thirsty. That thirst area in your hypothalamus makes you thirsty, and so you're going to drink more. So if you're drinking more fluids, then that's going to increase your fluid volume, and it will help to dilute some of that sodium concentration. ADH will also be released. ADH is released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and it causes your kidneys to retain water, so you're retaining more water, and again, that is going to help to dilute that sodium that's in your blood. Clinical intervention for a person that has a dehydration or hypernatremia would be to give them hypotonic fluids either by mouth or through IV, intravenous methods. Now let's take a look at abnormal water gains. Right? So in this case, you're overhydrating. So a person is bringing in too much water. They're ingesting pure water without any electrolytes, or they're receiving a hypotonic solution for maybe too long a period of time, and so they are overhydrating their blood and their interstitial fluid. This is going to raise the water volume without raising the electrolytes because they're bringing in water, but they're not bringing in any electrolytes. So in this case, we look at our picture down here, we end up where we have an increased water in the plasma and we have an increased water in the interstitial fluid. And so what's going to happen then is that the water, that excess water, is going to move into the cells because water wants to move towards the solutes. And so it's going to move into the cells where there's more solutes. So when we get this water shift into the intracellular fluid, that's going to result in both the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid having slightly larger volumes. So there's going to be more volume in the extracellular fluid, and now there's going to be more volume in the intracellular fluid. There's also going to be lower osmotic concentrations because, in other words, it's going to be dilute. So we're going to have a decreased osmotic or electrolyte concentration in the extracellular fluid, and we're also going to have a dilute or a decreased osmotic concentration inside the cells. So it's dilute in both the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. It's not good for cells to be diluted like that. It will disrupt cellular function and it could cause convulsions, coma, or even death. Overhydrating is going to cause hyponatremia in the blood vessel. So hypo means low and natremia means sodium in the blood. So we have low sodium in the blood. If this is untreated, it can lead to convulsions, coma, and death. Okay, then that's going to end this video on fluid balance. And in our next video, we're going to talk about electrolyte balance, and then we're going to go into acid and base balance. So we'll see you next time.